Hello, everyone. This is Devleena this side, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. It's a special topic that we have chosen this time to sort of discuss those on the fringes of healthcare. And COVID-19 in many ways has been told to be a great equalizer, but at the same time, we've also seen how it has not been such an equalizer. We have seen a lot of gaps that were systemic gaps that have all of a sudden erupted, and especially the treatment towards those who have been at the margins there's a lot of gaps and questions that have arisen there. We have seen that because of the differences in underlying different sections of the society, differences in social, economic, and health infrastructure, the treatment necessarily has not been as fair as people believe it to be. Having said that, we do have a more lucid understanding of the gaps in these systems supporting healthcare. And should we then see the pandemic as an opportunity for improvement? Should we take a step back and reflect on what can be changed and what can be done, and get ready to reconstruct a new normal? I want to sort of introduce our panelists today. Gautam Bhan, who joins us from Indian Institute of Health Sciences, Indian Institute of Human Settlements. We have Divya Verma with us, who works with the Ajivika, and we also have Dr. Yogesh Kalkonde with us, who works with Surge. I'm all recorded and we will share it widely. We do use our social media platforms to share it, so please keep an eye on those. If you have any questions, you do see the question box in the panel on your right. So please use the question box to submit your questions. And the panelists are providing their views on the current situation as experts and not speaking on behalf of the government or associated organizations. So before we, I think I can probably introduce our panelists now. We have Dr. Yogeshwar Kalkonde with us, who joins us from, Yukti, can we move to the next slide? Who joins us from Society of Education, Action and Research in Community Health. Yogesh has been a public health researcher, practitioner, advocate, and a neurologist, and we've all known his great work that he's been doing in the tribal communities and in rural communities who have limited access to healthcare. We also have Divya Verma with us, who joins us from the Center for Migration and Labor Solutions, Ajivika Bureau in Rajasthan. Divya has been working on engaging with a range of stakeholders from the industry and government, especially working on with migrant laborers and labor solutions. He has been previously associated with the Institute of Financial Management and Research and was at Asylum Access. We also have with us Gautam Bhan, who joins us from Indian Institute of Human Settlements. Gautam has been doing a lot of research on the politics of urban poverty and inequality, urban planning and theory, housing and identity. His work on identity and social practice has been well renowned. A very warm welcome to our panelists, and thank you so much. I'm going to now bring in Yogesh to sort of help us understand the issues that we are seeing in the rural Indian context, on what has been the impact of COVID-19 on rural India. And thank you again for joining, all of us for joining us today. And before I give it to Yogesh, I would like to apologize once again for the technical glitch, and Yogesh, over to you now.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes. Yes, Yogesh.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. So good afternoon to everyone. And what I'm going to talk about is, how COVID-19 is going to impact the rural people. And as all of us are following on television or newspaper, the predominant theater of this pandemic seems to be the urban area. And then that raises a question that should rural India be worried about COVID-19? So let's take a look at the risk factors for COVID-19, and we could divide those into environmental and individual risk factors. And from the data that we have so far, it seems like COVID cases seem to be a function of travel or mobility, and urban residents or areas with high population density. And then at the individual level, we have risk factors such as age more than 60 years, those with underlying diseases like hypertension, diabetes, and cardiovascular diseases. So if we take these four risk factors, how does rural India fare in comparison with urban India? So let's take a look at some numbers. So in terms of population density, rural India has a population density of about 286 per square kilometer, as against 714 for. If you just compare with one of the densely populated cities, the Northeast Delhi had a population density of 36,155 square individuals per square kilometer, in Mumbai about 19,000. So rural India has population density about 6 times lower than urban India. And then as far as mobility, we could take a look at certain proxy indicators. So here I'm taking possession of two-wheeler vehicle as a proxy indicator for mobility. And you can see that the vehicles are about 2.5 times lesser than that in urban India. So both these factors seem to be potentially protective factors against COVID-19 pandemic. But there are also certain vulnerabilities. I mean, elderly population is particularly vulnerable to the effect of this disease, and the predominant mortality world over has been in this population. And if you look at percentage of people above the age of 60, it's not very different between rural and urban India. So about 8.3% of the population in rural area and 8.4% in urban India is above the age of 60. Let's look at people with high blood pressure and diabetes. So again, high blood pressure, there are not major differences in rural and urban area. Although in diabetes, we see that diabetes is almost half less common in rural area compared to urban area. Then look at healthcare services. If COVID-19 really spreads and people had to seek healthcare, then we know that 66% of the population of rural India or India is rural, but it only has 40% of total workforce, which includes doctors, nurses, and other paramedical workers. And then the challenge that we have in rural India is all these resources are very dispersed. So if you have to mobilize them, it is very hard to mobilize them. Then coming to vulnerabilities, people's perceptions are guiding their response at this time. And I'm sharing a local experience that we see in rural and tribal Gadchiroli. So far, people are worried about COVID-19, and this is largely driven by media messages. And good thing is we have seen that technology, especially mobile technology, has reached rural and even deep-seated tribal areas, and people now who have access to information, although it is less, but they do have access to this information. So right now the fear is overweighing the lived experience of no cases around. In rural area, behavior is usually dictated by lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. And so right now the fear overweighs lived experience, but that might change if they don't see cases around. And then there are also certain perceptions that people thinking that, I do hard physical work in farms, so I'm unlikely to get COVID. Then the other thing that guides people's behavior is lived experience. And certainly there is no recent lived experience of pandemics. And this is an interesting quote from a tribal elder that I met a few days ago. And he said that about 100 plus years ago, there was a Murray meaning pandemic, that was in our village. And, there were a lot of people who died, and they could not individually bury them, so they just gave a pint of alcohol to a bullock cart driver who just took the dead bodies to the jungle. But they don't know, what to expect if the pandemics comes to villages. The impact, as far as the impact is concerned, you could divide it into different phases. So we are seeing through right now impact of the lockdown. Then as we will go towards staggered lifting of the lockdown, we will see exodus of migrants coming from urban and rural areas to the rural areas. Then there could be a possible spread of infection in rural communities, and then there could be next phase about which we don't know yet. And then as far as the impact of the lockdown that we see in newspapers as well as we see around is, food security issues are predominantly there in urban families trapped in urban or other rural areas. But in villages, we have started seeing that the elderly people who do not have children and live by themselves have started, having issues with food security. Then impact on livelihood, even in agriculture area, people think that, all of them are, landowners, but that's not true. Only 45% are cultivators, and, rest 55% are agricultural laborers who are dependent on daily wages, and their daily wages are suffering right now as we are going through lockdown. And just to get an extent, I mean, the plight of the migrants is played out in the media significantly, and just to get a sense as to how many migrants might be there. And according to one estimate, it's about 40 million internal migrants. Those could be affected by this lockdown at this time. And I think Divya will speak more on this later. And then what we see is, especially in urban areas, we see dehumanization occurring, and people have to resort to very demeaning practices to get food. And people are migrating. I mean, they are very distressed in urban area, and they are trying to move to their native village. Where they will have more dignity and more resources. And a few days ago, there was a story of a 12-year-old girl who died because of exhaustion while walking. And even in Gadchiroli, we see every day each village gets 3 to 4 people who walk literally hundreds of kilometers to reach the village. And as far as the effect on local healthcare seeking, what we see in our rural hospital is the consultations are reduced by almost 5-folds. And there are challenges for patients to travel as well as and seek care. And this has led to disruption of both healthcare seeking and delivery. In urban areas, you see that doctors are not getting paramedical workers to come and do their clinics. So even there, the consultations have gone down significantly. And this is going to result in short and long-term effects on the health of rural people. And as of now, we don't know how this is going to play out because there is hardly any data. So going forward, the question is, can rural communities face this challenge? And there are manifold challenges in rural areas. The social issues would be lower level of information, resources, and behavior change may take long compared to what we see in urban areas. The real challenge in terms of medically managing COVID-19 in rural areas is essentially there is no testing facility. So for us in Gadchiroli, the nearest testing facility is 200 kilometers away in Nagpur. And then, healthcare facilities are also inadequate. And key thing is lack of real-time data. I mean, there are hardly any reported rural cases as of now, but we don't know. There could be, rural cases and there could be rural deaths. The good thing about this epidemic is that most of the cases are mild. I mean, 85% of cases are mild and only 15% need hospitalization. So one could argue that 85% of this response to COVID could be actually managed at the community level, since most of the cases are mild, through community action and containment, and only 50% need to go to medical systems to seek care. And community actions, what we have seen is that a lot of gram panchayats have sprung into action, and they have gotten information through television and social media. This particular gram panchayat made masks for people, and it distributed masks to people in the village. This particular village actually made arrangements for quarantine of migrants who are coming out from districts where there are COVID cases. And even in tribal areas, we have seen distribution of hand sanitizers and masks. And in general, the community is very curious and ready to take action at this time. So key thing that we have realized would be community mobilization in rural and tribal areas. And SEARCH has developed a program which focuses on awareness, specific actions, guiding community to take certain actions to prevent COVID, quarantining of cases, and referral only where needed so as not to inundate the healthcare system, and essentially surveillance to gather some data to get a sense as to where things are going at least in the area that we work in, Gadchiroli. And we are going to see a short and long-term impact on rural population, and socio-economic impact could be actually more than health impact. We'll have to see how this unfolds, and there'll be issues in farming, people who are dependent on forest produce collection to earn some money, poultry, and so on. And how this might play out in the rural area would be that what we are seeing in the US is now gradually cases are spreading from urban areas to small towns which are adjacent to the cities, big cities, and then there will be communities or villages which are along the highways. So these are the two potential areas where it could start in rural areas. So to summarize, essentially COVID-19 is a stress test for health and even social systems. And in rural area and tribal area particular, governmental machinery is very weak in villages. So essentially we have to design rural context or tribal context specific strategies with emphasis on community action and local governance. And interestingly, technology is playing and will be playing an important role in this response. And the question will be, will COVID-19 be a bigger disease of economy than body, is something that we will have to see as it unfolds in rural area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yogesh. I think those were really some very valid points expressing some of the pain points right now that we are seeing in terms of how COVID is impacting people in the rural population, and definitely bringing out a lot of lived experiences of people and sort of helping us understand how these lived experiences need to be integrated in any policy response that the government would be drafting. I'm now going to bring in Divya Verma to sort of talk about what has been the impact on the migrant population. What you've been doing studies, what has that reflected, and what are the challenges there?
Thank you. Thank you, Devi, for this opportunity. So I felt that, because of the increased kind of media and public attention on the migrant community, there's a general curiosity regarding this population, like who are these workers, where are they coming from. So I thought I will start with a general kind of a context setting on the national scene and how migration looks like more nationally, and then come to our context and speak about some of the more lockdown specific issues that we see in our communities. So just to start, I think India is increasingly being referred to as a nation of footloose workers. There is an increasing magnitude of migration from rural areas to the cities to seek livelihood, to seek work in these urban areas. So if we look at the magnitude of seasonal migration in the country, there are no definite estimates, unfortunately, but according to the last round of economic survey in 2019, they say that it's about 139 million people. So they migrate seasonally from their villages to the urban areas. It could be short-term migration, long-term migration, anywhere ranging from 3 to 11 months. But the common factor is that most of them always go back home. Very few numbers of these migrants actually aspire to settle down in the cities. So they maintain two homes, so to say, in both the village as well as the urban areas. And mobility, of course, is a very important feature of their lives. They keep moving from the village to the city, between different work sites within the city. They sometimes move along with their contractors according to what their employment arrangement looks like, and they move from city to city in search of livelihood as well. So what are some of the drivers that have kind of triggered this phenomenon on such a large scale? So primarily it is, of course, the decline in the rural economy, the agricultural distress. Our rural economy is in shambles, and that's there are a lot of semi-arid kind of regions in the country, which is where the situation has been precipitated due to climate change, where agriculture is no longer a viable livelihood strategy. So that's in fact been driving people to city in large numbers. And if you look at the urban kind of economic centers where most of these people go to, what are some of the major sectors that employ workers in large numbers? So it's construction. That's the single biggest employer of migrant workers in the country, followed by domestic work, textile, power looms, and stitching garment units, mines and quarrying, manufacturing and recycling. Agriculture, of course, is a big kind of an employer which sees a lot of family migration. So a lot of women and children also migrate along with the men and work in these farms in far-flung areas. Head loading in large market yards, say vegetable markets, fruit markets, grain markets. That's another important kind of sector that absorbs migrant workers. And hospitality, ranging from the big kind of hotel chains to dhabas and restaurants at the very bottom end. So these are some of the major sectors that absorb migrant workers. And predictably, there is a particular direction. There are identified migration corridors and a directionality to these movements. So for example, some of the major sending states are those that figure very low on social development indices, human development indices. So Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Jharkhand, Odisha, Rajasthan are some of the prominent sending states that send out large numbers of migrants. And the key receiving states are those that have been some of the biggest economic centers in the country today, like Kerala, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Delhi, and Karnataka. And if we look at the socio-demographic profile of these workers, predictably, again, many of them come from historically marginalized communities, such as Dalits or Adivasi communities, which are also often landless in their own villages. So agriculture is, again, not a viable livelihood option. So this kind of mobility and migration just really adds another dimension of vulnerability to their lives. And if you look at examine the work conditions in which these people work, generally, they predominantly work in the informal economy, which means that they work on the very bottom rungs in very low value, low paid, hazardous, precarious kind of occupations in all these sectors that I mentioned above. And none of their terms of work are really enforceable in the world of law, because there are no written contracts governing this kind of an employment arrangement between the worker and the employer. Of course, there are many issues that migrant communities face that have, of course, been accentuated by the lockdown. But we need to remember that these were pre-existing, long-standing vulnerabilities that have only been compounded or precipitated due to the lockdown, like you said in the beginning of your kind of introduction. Also, there are a lot of fault lines in our society, in our policies, that have been really kind of thrown open by this that's imposed by the COVID. So from our experience with practice on the ground, if we were to just talk about the health situation of migrant workers, our kind of practice with migrant communities in cities have again revealed, like Yogesh was just mentioning in his presentation, chronic levels of hypertension and diabetes. There is a large incidence of malaria, cholera, and diarrhea. Again, a combination of these precarious work conditions as well as congested living conditions, a combination leads to the high incidence of TB, tuberculosis, besides, of course, various other occupational injuries, risks, accidents that all of them are subject to on a frequent basis. So, as I said before, Ajivika Bureau recently undertook a study where we tried to examine the extent of migrant workers' access to urban public services, and how do they really feature in the policy imagination of the urban development policies in our country today. We also interviewed a lot of urban government functionaries as part of this exercise. And some of the findings that came to light were that more than 90% of migrants we interviewed preferred to access private healthcare facilities. Again, this is just to highlight the fact that they're completely outside the ambit of the public healthcare systems in the cities. Again, their mobility itself is a very important reason for this. But again, an important reason is also the unsuitable timings of our urban health centers, where migrants will necessarily have to forego a day's wage to be able to access these healthcare facilities. Linguistic barriers, in many cases, they do not talk the language of the doctor or the nurse present in these urban health centers. And large public hospitals are, of course, very complex to navigate for an illiterate tribal migrant worker who comes from a rural area. Even if we think about early childcare and immunization kind of services, we saw that the incentives of ASHA and Anganwadi workers are largely misaligned to the nature of lives that these communities lead. For example, they're incentivized for continuously kind of immunizing a pregnant woman or a child, which is, of course, the intent is to ensure the quality and consistency of service delivery. But with the kind of mobile lives that migrant communities lead, there is a very high chance that these migrants and their families, and especially their children who travel with them, are deprived of these critical services very early in their lives. Again, another structural failure, if we were to examine some of the structural failures in our policies, one of the most important kind of point is that they're not part of the enumeration, the official enumeration at any level of administration. So, for example, if we take the national level, the census or the national sample survey, which are the two largest data collection exercises in the country, they do not capture migration in any meaningful way. Again, there's no accounting for state level migration flows, or even at the city level, they are not part of the official population of the cities, and their settlements themselves are either in the periphery of the city, or they live in the confines of their work sites. So their settlements are never enumerated as official or authorized kind of settlements by the city municipal corporation. So the impact of all of this is that they are completely invisible to the policy design and policy implementation kind of machinery, which means that they get left out of the scope of important public services like water and sanitation, immunization, and any kind of public health services. Then the second kind of big structural issue that I want to bring about is the sedentary bias in our policies. And what do I mean by that? It means that in order to access every single public service, one needs to provide a proof of domicile or residency in the city. So basically, you have to provide an address proof that you are a legitimate bona fide resident of the city to be able to access a public service in the city. So that's again, our survey found that more than 95% of the seasonal migrants do not have a ration card in the city. So which meant that during this time of the coronavirus lockdown, they were completely out of the purview of the PDS shops, and even the relief package announced by the finance minister, which sought to provide relief through existing channels, would not be useful for the migrant workers because the migrant workers are outside these existing channels. So intensification of the ration food supply through the ration PDS system was not at all beneficial for the migrants. This need to establish domicile applies to a whole host of welfare schemes, including health at a tertiary level and kind of welfare schemes related to health. So what do they do usually when they fall sick? Because they are unable to access the health system in the city, they usually go back to the familiar pastures of their village, where they live in remote areas and where the level of primary healthcare that's available is anyway suboptimal. So if we were to examine the kind of COVID specific or the lockdown specific impact on the migrant communities, I think it's been written about a lot in the media. But again, I just want to emphasize here that in our communities, we are yet to see a spike in the COVID cases. There have been some positive cases, but most of them have been managed through isolation. Many are, of course, stranded in cities in very, very unhygienic and congested conditions. But the lockdown itself has created conditions where it has become difficult to access healthcare for a large number of other people who suffer other morbidities like hypertension and diabetes. So public health experts in our organization are actually expecting a huge increase in the non-COVID related mortality in the short term, because treatment and care for other illnesses have been really severely compromised due to the attention towards corona. For example, there is a huge delay in sputum testing for tuberculosis. ANC and immunization care has been largely delayed for a lot of pregnant women, and people also are not able to step out in case of illnesses to access healthcare because of fear of police harassment, especially in rural areas where also we work.
Give you a quick time note. We maybe just 2 more minutes to wrap up, probably,
Yes,
and then
yes,
we will continue the discussion.
Yeah. Sure, yeah. So, and of course, somebody had raised a question about the psychological impacts of this. Of course, there's a huge fear of corona, a lot of mental distress, suicides are on the rise, and domestic violence is, of course, a huge issue that we are finding in our communities. Some of the solutions need to be around strengthening public primary healthcare systems so that there's no huge burden on the large hospitals, and that can be minimized. In our tuberculosis centers, we are distributing 1 month supplies of TB medicines in one go. And also providing cooked meals to our children in our Anganwadis. In general, I think Ajivika Bureau has been arguing very strongly for repatriation of migrant workers back home from the cities. Of course, after putting in place health protocols and screening them for symptoms, and those who are symptomatic should be given treatment, but those who are not, those who test negative should be repatriated and allowed to go home. Again, in the long term, I think enumeration and identification of migrant settlements and making sure that these invisible kind of settlements also receive public healthcare services will be a right step to take. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Divya, for that really important debrief on how migrants who are sort of the invisible workforce and make the cities going are right now currently being affected by COVID. And I think it's a great time to bring in Gautam to sort of help us understand. Definitely there are fault lines that have been opened up, but this is also a time to sort of probably reflect back and step back to understand how can we work on those fault lines. So I'm going to bring in Gautam to sort of help us understand what does social protection now mean in an urban setting, especially for migrants and informal work.
Thanks, Devi. Thanks, everyone. So I'll do 2 things in my 10 minutes. One is to think a little bit about notions of the informal worker and the informal economy as a particular site for the lockdown. And the other is to focus on some of the questions that came in after the webinar was announced yesterday about lockdown-specific approaches to informal settlements. And I think that distinction is important in thinking about informality is a lot of things. And the nature of informal work is different from the spatial nature of informal settlements. So I'll treat them differently. So, picking up on what Divya said, the geographer Neil Smith, after the Hurricane Katrina floods in the US, had actually said there is no such thing as a natural disaster. And I think that it is a very timely reminder to say that the exposure may be external, but disasters make visible pre-existing vulnerabilities that both shape the experience of a shock, and they also shape the way you're able to recover from that shock. So we have to be able to use COVID as a kind of diagnostic to understand what are the pre-existing vulnerabilities that are causing the disaster to take the shape it is. It's not just a question of something happening to us from the outside. So what I want to frame this as is to say, my colleague Kinjal Sampath and others have argued quite a simple understanding. The nature of relief is inversely proportional to the depth of your pre-existing social protection, which means the more you had institutions and entitlements that allowed a safety net for all residents. Note, I'm using the word residents and not just workers, because social protection is not only due to people who work, it's also due to all residents and all citizens. And I think that the more you have an institutional structure that always delivered health, food, housing, water, sanitation at a universal dignity minimum threshold, you can use those same institutions to repurpose into relief. Kerala is an excellent example. Because it had decentralized institutions of public feeding, it can do massive community kitchens because the labor, the construction, the institution exist. In Delhi, which is doing an admirable effort at large-scale feeding, it still has to create an additional 1,500 schools from which to give ration to non-ration card holders because those systems don't exist. So what I would say is all of us must be asking in each of our states, in each of our cities, where was there a need to come up with new delivery mechanisms for relief measures? Every time we came up with a new delivery mechanism for a relief measure, it is telling us that that institution did not exist before the crisis. It's a map of the missing social protection. Because the provocation I want to give and leave you with is that much of what we are calling expanded relief in response to this crisis is actually the social protection we should have in normal times before the crisis hits. This is true not only because in the Anthropocene and in climate change, repeated waves of global pandemic are going to be the reality for the generations to come. COVID is not the first, it's not going to be the last. So we have to reduce pre-existing vulnerabilities. And I want to sort of say that many things that this crisis has made us see is that even though levels of poverty have declined in India over the last 15 years, there's no debate about this, levels of vulnerability may not have declined the same way. Which means that for many households that go out of poverty, it takes only one shock to drop them back. Now that shock can be an injury, an illness, a wedding, a funeral, a bad monsoon, a different kind of shock that drops people back. Recognizing the vulnerable nature of poverty, it's not a one-directional move out. It's a move out that has many falls back in. That's why you need a safety net. That's why that metaphor is often used for social protection to think about a safety net. So if we're thinking about informal settlements, the tenure illegality, the housing uncertainty of people who live in dense informal settlements at this point is exacerbating their vulnerability to cope with the crisis. The absence of sanitation facilities at a universal level in informal settlements is exacerbating an exposure and coping to crisis. So we're essentially putting, in a sense, our finger on pre-existing vulnerabilities. And what's happening is that the social protection gaps that were there earlier are also preventing an adequate disaster risk reduction and mitigation response. They're not just mitigating a response to generalized social protection. Let me take a very particular example of the informal settlement to make this point. When you look at informal settlements vulnerability, all these vulnerabilities are playing down in the combination of COVID plus lockdown. And I'm saying COVID plus lockdown because they are two different shocks, and it's important to recognize them as two different shocks. And what's happening in COVID plus lockdown to informal settlements is that the livelihood uncertainty, where what happens to people at 5 days without income, 10 days without income, 15 days without income, and 30 days without income are a series of economic livelihood shocks. And it's very important to realize that they are different kinds of shocks at 5, 15, and 30 days. right? At 5 days, your savings begin to run out. At 15 days, your food begins to run out. At 30 days, your rent begins to kick in. And so therefore, you see a series of interconnected shocks that we have to differentiate. The second is that the urban environment you live in, which is dense, which is inadequately serviced with infrastructure, which often has risks of eviction and tenure, all combine to actually mitigate your ability to respond to the crisis. So when we think a little bit about what informal settlements can be doing, there are 3 points that I want to make that's very important. And I think the lessons from Ebola in managing responses in informal settlements is a very key archive all of us should be turning to. What did Ebola teach us? It taught us that countries that were able to overcome that epidemic did so because of 3 things. One, communities were empowered for voluntary disclosure of symptoms. It was not just a surveillance-based approach. It was an approach that trusted and worked with communities to say, let community-based associations and actors be the first forefront in this fight. The more, what would empower someone to voluntarily declare symptoms? 3 core things. 1, dignified quarantine, which is transparent, which is known from advance and is public. Everyone knows where they will go should they declare symptoms. 2, economic compensation for the household should a working member of the family or an adult member of the family need to go into quarantine. And this is very important, that it cannot be the economic compensation of an individual wage. It has to be an economic compensation for a household. 3, the food and social protection, food security preventions for the household during the period of quarantine and before. And 4, I think the option of thinking of a gap and middle solution between stay-at-home quarantine, only possible for the elite, and central quarantine or a public quarantine, which many communities distrust because of a long history of distrust of state capacity. I would like to think that many communities that I know have the capacity, if they are given leadership and resources and information, to generate what we can call a community quarantine, which is a quarantine that is created at settlement level through the repurposing of a built environment. It could take 3 or 4 shacks that are isolated, one particular gully or a narrow lane in a settlement that is cordoned off, that is done not through a surveillance police pressure of sealing alone, but actually done through community action. Many communities I know, informal settlements in cities, are already doing this on their own. They're guarding. So what they're doing is saying that in dense informal settlements, the scale of quarantine cannot be the house. You cannot expect 8 to 10 people of a family to be stay-at-home quarantined in a house that itself is smaller than 25 square meters, 30 square meters, 40 square meters, right? So the scale of quarantine has to be the narrow street that is in North Indian languages often called the gully. And the minute you change the scale of quarantine to the gully, the infrastructure of safety and entry-exit changes. So the mouth of the gully becomes a sanitization point of a public sanitization point, right? The community quarantine can also work in the same way. We have to be able to work with communities. What stops this from happening? 2 things. One is that without adequate food security and social protection, many of these communities are saying something very simple. The lockdown's point, its outcome, is to prevent death. What they are saying is we also are trying to prevent death. And a death that occurs due to economic hardship, a death that occurs due to a non-COVID health issue, and a death that occurs due to COVID are all 3 equally likely vectors to death for poor communities. And I think that we have to absolutely understand that the distinction between saying that COVID deaths should be prevented, but the consequence of economic death and non-COVID related health deaths have to be prevented at the same time. So therefore, we must empower communities to make trade-offs and decisions at the community level. And why this is not happening is that very often the history of these communities and their current relief lockdown both, their first interaction, for example, is with the punitive arm of the state. It's with the police. It is not actually with health workers. It's not an invitation to work and lead a response where the community appreciates the risks that are happening to it. Now, I understand that some communities are more organized than others. But communities have the ability to respond to this organization if the invitation is extended. The last point I'll make as my 10 minutes are up is to say that what this also requires is very specific and targeted information for health practices that are appropriate to dense informal settlements. It should not be wash your hands and use sanitizer. It's how do you make sure that you are risk-free if the water runs out? How do you have sanitary practices at a public toilet? How do you think about crowding in density and use the gully as a space of sanitation and not the house? I'm very happy to see that the principal scientific advisor to the government, their office has released an informal settlement specific communication guideline just a few days ago. And I think that's the first step in this direction. But we need to understand and give information that respects people's context and allows for their leadership. So in summary, what I'll say is just 3 things that I want to leave with everyone on the webinar. 1, there is nothing that can compensate as relief if you have pre-existing absence, structural absence of social protection. 2, the current crisis should be a diagnostic that tells us of the kind of social protection system we should have. And we must hold on to everything that is being today called relief and turn it into normal social protection 6 months from now, 12 months from now. We must not see this as a temporary creation of structures. All the innovations, all the new cash transfers, all the ration being given to non-ration card holders. This is the description of the system we must have. This is not the description of adequate relief. This should be the description of the norm. The second is, I think, to think about a specific approach to informal settlements that is community-led, that explores community quarantine where possible, with encouraging voluntary disclosure of symptoms and an approach that partners with communities instead of surveils them and creates information and practices that is rooted in their life worlds and trusts them to be able to be engaged and empowered actors to take care of themselves and not treat them as populations that have to be protected, but actually the actual experts who know how to manage community affairs more than any of us who don't live in these communities will. And I stop with that. And I think the last sentence I do want to say is the idea of the universal that has come back into social protection discourse. It's a very welcome return of a word after means targeting, focused social protection only to BPL only. What we're realizing here is we have got to stop worrying about the type 2 error. We've got to stop worrying about the false inclusion. We've got to start saying that anyone who's remotely at risk should be included. If some people who aren't at risk get included, that's a price worth paying. Universal approaches mean that our data faults are overcome, they're easier to deliver, they are better to monitor, and systems that are universal always will function better than systems that are targeted, especially in a country with societal fault lines like ours and weak state capacity in many like ours. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Gautam. I think there's no better way to drive the point that nothing about the community without the community that can happen. And I think there's enough lesson that we have learned from the past pandemics and past endemics that you cannot engage the community without being engaged with them. I'm going to come to Dr. Yogesh and probably ask you, Dr. Yogesh, that COVID-19 has definitely thrown up some unprecedented challenges, and for rural India, where already the health infrastructure is extremely burdened, what is now happening to the other health issues that were already prevalent? What's happening to dialysis patients? What's happening to people who want to seek services for abortion or other cardiac issues and many other essential health issues?
So, it's a very valid, important point, and unfortunately, there is no clear data out there. But what we see on the ground is that all these services are significantly affected. And I just gave an example of our hospital where the consultations have gone down 5 to 6 times. So one could just imagine, and talking to other friends who are doctors, and the significant reduction in availability of health services. So I think community will have to suffer, which is a sad thing.
That's a very sad. But what do you suggest? Like, because COVID is not going to go, it's here to stay. The lockdown might be lifted. What is it that needs to be done now to ensure? And it cannot be that we do not provide the essential healthcare services to the communities. We have to.
So gradually, things will have to normalize as we can. I mean, essentially, the hospitals could be working, but because of lockdown, patients cannot reach the hospital. There is no point. So, one answer to this could be, whatever services can be provided at the level of community, we essentially have to strengthen the peripheral points of healthcare delivery. And, right now we don't have good peripheral points of healthcare delivery. There is a primary healthcare center, but as Divya was mentioning, that people don't prefer using government hospitals or government facilities unless they are in an area where there is no alternative. So we really need to strengthen this, and the community health and wellness centers, if they would have been existing and working today, would have significantly reduced this distress. Functional sub-centers would have significantly reduced need to travel, so that you could, you don't have to travel much. For certain services, yes, you would have to travel. For example, dialysis is something where you will have to travel to a higher center, and there are grave dangers to lives of people who need dialysis on a regular basis. So again, as the theme that is coming out of this is it's essentially exposing the existing weaknesses in our structure, and the outreach of facilities needs to increase. I mean, the current stance of the government is to attract people to the facilities so that they can seek care. I think that the answer is the other way around. Especially for rural communities, you need to increase outreach of services so that they don't really need to travel that much.
Right. I'm also going to probably, Divya, you briefly touched on this fact that, the ASHA workers and the frontline health workers have been a huge workforce, and they carry a lot of burden on the front line to ensure access to health. Maybe Dr. Yogesh and Divya, if you guys can probably put some light on what needs to be done there. The reality is that they also are extremely marginalized. We have seen them demanding for they're mostly stipend based. Insurance still remains a challenge. What is it that in terms of rural and public health system that needs to change now, and what are the lessons to take forward from COVID?
Divya, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think my perspectives on this are kind of limited to what I know from the services provided by ASHA workers to migrant communities in specific. So we found that their incentives to serve migrant communities and migrant settlements are very skewed and misaligned. So I think starting, and I think that has also been, their compensation has also been like the broader pitch of all the kind of mobilization efforts of ASHA workers that we've seen in the country today. So I think some reform in terms of their incentive structure. Again, in terms of the workload that an ASHA worker has to bear, it's very, very, very large. So they don't have incentives to add new settlements to their. They are empowered to add new settlements, but they don't have any incentive to add new settlements to their the areas that they can service. So I think really incentivizing them meaningfully in a way that many of these vulnerable communities who are on the fringes of healthcare receive these services. And that's one of the perspectives that I have with respect to the communities that we work with.
And then, yeah, I mean, I agree with what Divya said. I mean, essentially, we have the number of ASHAs that we have right now is not going to be adequate, given that a lot of rural India is undergoing a change in lifestyle, which is fast urbanizing. So, although we call them rural, their lifestyles have already become urban. So ASHAs were predominantly created, the cadre was created to address the maternal and child health needs, but now community also has chronic diseases needs, and there is some discussion regarding increasing the number of ASHAs in rural communities, because they do play a very important role in especially places like Gadchiroli. They have been helping improve maternal and child health services. So I mean, their incentivization should improve. B, their numbers also. And that's the real thing would be, search works on the concept of Arogya Swaraj. So I think empowering a lady in the village itself to sort of take up as many challenges, health challenges as possible would certainly democratize healthcare. So that is a cadre that we need to build in. Unfortunately, our health culture has been that of a super specialist culture. We believe in building larger hospitals and having superstar, medical specialists, but we forget that in public health, small interventions actually end up saving more lives. I mean, if you compare people lives saved because of a simple, stupid solved solution called ORS versus number of people saved because of, certain big cardiac surgeries, the ORS will probably beat the cardiac surgery any time. So, these public health solutions are really simple. Sometimes they are so simple that people don't believe in them, but we really need to sort of bring in primary care and make ASHA a centerpiece in that whole strategy.
Right. And so I know you, Dr. Yogesh, pointed out that how fear and the kind of messages that are being propagated through the media, the fake news basically, is something that has led to a very increased fear in the population groups. I want to sort of understand how is that impacting the access to services. And maybe Gautam, if you can also sort of help us understand We've seen at the quarantine centers, there are a lot of fake news that are going on. What is the impact that's happening on ground because of these fake news, and how can we combat that?
It's a challenge. I think one of the ways to counter that would be start giving appropriate messages and compete. And suddenly the thing that we saw in rural area, the moment COVID cases started appearing in urban India, is people stop consuming chicken and eggs, and that is still, I think, ongoing. And people are still scared of that. They think that this is going to spread through chicken. So there is enormous amount of misinformation on COVID, and it's one of the challenges that we have is to bring in right information and try and minimize the harm created by misinformation. But for the Indian mind, it seems like it almost has entertainment value. The misinformation seems to have an entertainment value, so people are very actively consuming it. Gautam might have a perspective from urban angle.
I mean, this is a very difficult one, because I think there are two kinds of misinformation. I mean, I would say three kinds of misinformation that are really troubling right now. The first, of course, is scientific misinformation, right? And I think that's the one that's a little bit easier, I would say, to handle, even though its effects are out. The other two is that in the absence of clear communication by states, there are constantly there is a constant swarm of words of people trying to understand what is happening and what's not happening. I think the sight of migrant workers at the Bandra station, with a WhatsApp that circulates that say that special trains are running. I mean, this is exact, and I think the states have to really be respectful of how transparent and how actively, proactively transparent they need to be about clarity of measures and practices they're taking, because people are, I mean, the levels of anxiety about what is possibly happening and not wanting to be left out of a single relief measure or a single new policy move or a single new benefit is very, very high. And I think that people are, even more than usual, I think that state governments need to take communication very, very seriously. The third, I think, is much harder, which is that there is no denying the fact that the existing social polarizations on gender, caste, religion, region, and language that define our polity — we are a deeply, deeply unequal polity — have been pressed, and they have been violently and powerfully used to actually taint this virus in order to transmit and reproduce social power. And this is not just an urban-rural question. And I think that is something that is not about misinformation. That's actually about societal power inequalities playing themselves out. And that has to be really, it is on all of us to take it on, to call it out, to not pretend that it's anything else, whether it's a question of reflections on caste or communalization, or real understandings about migrant workers or residents of informal settlements. And these are showing us these kinds of social fault lines that have pre-existed. And there's a very dangerous moment where this can deepen existing societal discrimination on the basis of identity of all kinds. And I think we have to be very, very careful, and we have to be absolutely uninhibited in calling it out when it happens.
Right. I'm going to throw the next question, which basically is asking that how do you decide where to isolate patients or quarantine with dignity? What goes behind choosing, and what evidence do we have about the best practices globally?
This is a very, very difficult question. And I have to say, I'm answering it literally with the same knowledge base as the person who asked the question. I have no health expertise to be able to talk about medical quarantine facilities. So I will only suggest and say, I think everywhere everywhere around the world, people are struggling. You see the same modalities coming: temporary structures, reconverted stadia, reconverted schools, reconverted. The speed at which this is required, I think, is very difficult for any kind of, to think about any kind of really new innovation practice. So I think that we must appreciate the very difficult trade-offs that governments face in being able to create large-scale dignified quarantine. I welcome the state governments that have chosen to make private hospital resources public temporarily to do this, to think about those kinds of hospital facilities. I would echo what Yogesh was saying earlier, that if we had primary and secondary level health institutions We would have a much better infrastructure. Even right now in all our cities, it is the big tertiary hospitals that we're requisitioning. It's the big tertiary hospitals in the primary. And that's part, it's again telling us that public health structures are built on the primary and the secondary. They're built on early diagnosis and referral. They cannot be built through building multiple large super specialty tertiary care hospitals. And I think, so, right now we're going to have to do the best we can. But here, I think the question will be to really recognize transparency of information is going to really be your biggest ally. Because if people are going to accept difficult quarantine circumstances, and many of them will be difficult, we have to be very pragmatic about this, knowing what they're getting into is going to make them the most likely to be able to bring their own resilience to go through it. So I think that while we have to really think about how we can do this best, if the number of cases exist, stadia are stadia. They're not going to turn into hospitals overnight. So I think we just have to be honest about the limitations and the difficulties, and the more transparent the information on quarantine. And the second is the idea that I was suggesting, is that for where stay-at-home quarantine is not possible, let communities that know their neighborhoods offer solutions for community level quarantine. Let them take, one street in a settlement and say, all the people who live here will move out on rent, and let this become only the quarantine street. The closer the quarantine is to the home. So I think we just have to think that there is a space between the home and the stadium. We can't have just those two scales going on. Let's find more localized, medium, small level shelters that are decentralized, because the closer people are to home, in the same ward, in the same community, the more open they will be to going to quarantine.
Right.
I agree with Gautam. I think in rural areas, the challenge that they have is every day there are 3 or 4 migrants who are coming in from outside the state. So they are puzzled as to what to do with these migrants, and they are coming out with ideas which are their own, like essentially using schools that are closed now to create structures to quarantine. And one of the challenges would be, if migrant workers who came, they go through a level of quarantine and they come back again to the villages still have the insecurity that what if this person brings in, COVID-19. So one of the dangers for migrants would be a double level of quarantine. So they have spent already 2-3 weeks, and again, the villagers may not feel comfortable, with them coming in the villages. So there could be another 2-3 weeks of quarantine, which could increase the hardships of the migrants significantly.
Right. I think a lot of questions are actually coming on what kind of community-based interventions have been right now placed, even in terms of behavior change strategies or community engagement strategies. If someone can highlight even lessons that we have learned from Ebola, and I leave it to you guys to discuss who will go first.
Divya, you want to take this one from some of the Ajivika work?
Yes, I think as I mentioned during my presentation also, so we run rural primary healthcare facilities in southern Rajasthan, in very tribal districts that are where the existing kind of healthcare facilities are very remote. So there again, as I mentioned, people have been really struggling to access other medication other than just corona. So for example, a diabetes patient who does not have access to insulin, just imagine the condition. So in such cases, like our health centers have been undertaking door-to-door outreach, like Yogesh was talking about, and actually delivering doorstep, actually delivering these medicines doorstep to these communities. We are undertaking distribution of cooked meals to the children who where malnourishment levels are very high in these communities, who are earlier part of our Anganwadis, which have now had to be closed down due to the COVID situation. In Ahmedabad, for example, where our urban work happens, in these clusters where we run TB centers for diagnosis and linkage of migrants to the TB health system, we've been distributing medicines 1 month in bulk, so that the supply of medicines is uninterrupted for these populations. And again, as Yogesh was saying, again, so we mobilize women into solidarity groups in these villages. So we've been undertaking very community level kind of action in order to combat fake news and educate women in the villages with families of what the potential effects of corona and how to prevent it. So again, community level intervention in the villages and also in the urban areas, I think is very key to kind of combating this.
Yeah, I think from our side, three key examples I see urban informal communities doing. One is that I think there's a massive organization among communities for food security. From Delhi, which is the example I know best, there are community kitchens that are being run that do, localized feeding. There are communities that get together and are serving and making lists of families that need ration cards, helping them apply for the government schemes like the non-PDS ration schemes. And many of them are also reaching out with those lists, both to government as well as ration, but also to citizen groups and citizen food banks that are doing a lot of work in Delhi and in many other cities actually for providing dry and distributing dry ration. And it's the communities that are self-organizing for this distribution, identifying the most vulnerable families, distributing the ration as it's coming in. And where I have seen citizen efforts and government efforts be the most successful is where they're being met by communities that are self-organizing. And I think that I've also seen places where WhatsApp videos and TikTok videos and WhatsApp audio messages are being done that are circulating among communities on talking about health practices that are very rooted. So, for example, there's one that's going around a lot of Basti federations in Delhi that is actually about all the alternatives to sanitation practices when there's no running water. And it's talking about, protect the mouth of settlement, think about public buckets with water, think about alternatives like household products or bleach powder mixed with a certain kind, making homemade sanitizers that are using materials that are done. So I would say the 3-4 things that communities are doing very strongly, they're producing their own communication materials and circulating information. They're organizing around food security and identification of people who are of need and passing this on to citizen food banks and to government. And they're taking sort of spatial intervention precautions at the settlement level to create spaces of sanitation, to create some public spaces that are protected where people can get out of small homes for a period of time, regulating that. And I would repeat again that I think these are things that communities are doing, but the parts where they need serious help from, where they need to be met by the state, is a large enough supply of food delivery for example, for many urban communities, particularly in the next 3 months, is going to be a regular and commitment to giving public water supply. So remember, many of these settlements are off the individual water grid. And so a continuous supply of tanker-based drinking water delivery is going to be key. Information delivery is going to be key. So I think community-based initiatives are doing many things, but in many places like water, sanitation, information, and food supply, they should not be made responsible for a condition they did not bring on themselves. And so I think it's very important that while we talk about the importance of community partnership, that has to be a partnership in response to systemic state invitation, because otherwise it will be an abdication of responsibility on behalf of the state.
Right, thank you so much. I know we are a little over time, but if the panelists are okay, can we continue it for another 10 minutes? We have a lot of questions coming in. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you so much. So we do know that post-lockdown, essential services will sort of revive, and they are gradually reviving essential services. Globally, we have seen 2 models. One is a staggered lifting of the services, and one is at one go we have lifted the services. From your own understanding of the rural and the urban context, which way would you suggest India to go? And also, I sort of want to understand from whose lens are we even looking at essential services right now? If maybe Divya, do you want to start with that probably?
I can let Gautam go first.
Okay. I think, so I would say 2 things. I think, so there's 2 challenges. One is, globally, what seems to be emerging as the scientific public health consensus is that the idea of the lockdown was primarily to buy us the time to set up adequate screen, test, isolate protocols. So I think that we have to not deviate too much from that understanding. And so the easing of the lockdown has to be timed and depends on a robust system of people declaring systems, being screened, being able to be rapidly tested, and then being quarantined. You can only open up the rest of the space if you have a certainty that there will be early detection and isolation of the minority that get infected. So I think that given that, the approaches that I think that many places are seeming to coalesce around is the idea of saying we need to rapidly create containment zones. And these containment zones are not at the level of districts or wards, they're at the level of lanes, building societies, neighborhoods, small parts of containment zone with rapid kind of surveillance. And I think that that strategy will have to be the core of a lockdown moving. The more the capacity you have to screen, test, isolate, the more you can risk opening the lockdown. The less you have the capacity to screen, test, and isolate, the more the lockdown will have to be more total. So that capacity has to build, and that has to be an emphasis of the government. I think the question of what should open first, I would say there are very complex trade-offs here, but I would make two submissions. I think one is essential services that require immediate mitigation of social protection and human development consequences. Food, rent, shelter must obviously lead. The second is the more open lockdowns that can be guided by the maximum return to employment densification, as opposed to, say, output. So you're not interested here right now in opening up sectors that give you the most return on capital outputs for GDP. You're most interested in opening up sectors that are dense in employment and therefore will return income to the hands of the lower end of your socioeconomic distribution. Construction is something that gives you a good middle ground for this because it's both high output and high employment. You know, economic development professionals describe sectors in three ways. You have high output, high employment, high output, low employment. So construction is high output, high employment. IT is high output, low employment. And so I think we have to remind ourselves that the lockdown needs to open sectors that are high on output or medium on output or even low on output, but are high on employment. So, and any kind of places where one can combine employment generation with social protection is, to me, the first place you should look. So can you use paratransit, informal workers in rickshaws to deliver ration for social protection? Right? Can you use, what are the Venn diagrams that come in where community kitchens are both employment and social protection outcomes? Using in partners with community health workers. So I would say that those are the two things I would say. One is that you need that protocol of test and isolate before you can open. You should be looking at high employment sectors to open first, regardless of their output. And any sector that has an overlap with social protection, but also generates employment, should move as fast as possible. That's what I would say.
Yeah, just
in terms of rural area. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to what Gautam said, I think just a minor point that the decisions regarding geographical kind of opening up or staggering of the lockdown, as well as what essential items are being made available, I think these have to be really sensitive to the needs of the most vulnerable people. Because, for example, in our experience in working with migrant populations, especially those that are stuck in industrial peripheries of these cities, these big cities, they are outside the purview of municipal corporations. A lot of them are in Gram Panchayats that are registered in the periphery of these cities. So a lot of them are, because of this, kind of completely deprived of the cooked meals or the public kind of ration systems that have been set up by the government. As well as if you look at the kind of retail kirana stores, there also the availability of food, grains, and ration have gone down because of disrupted supply chains, and also there is a high degree of inflation. So even if a poor family has some amount of cash with them, they are still not able to afford these very basic supplies. So I think restoring normalcy to the supply chains, making sure that the essential kind of food items are available at normal prices, reducing the inflationary effects of this disrupted supply chains, reducing the inflationary effects of this lockdown, and ensuring that geographically, mapping out some of the where are some of the poorest communities in the cities, are they outside the periphery? So ensuring that access is uninterrupted in these areas, I think being sensitive to their needs is important.
Yeah. And in rural agrarian areas, the answer is relatively simple. I mean, this is a season. work pattern is very seasonal in the rural areas. So currently it's a season where, people choose to work in Manrega activities. So the Manrega activities need to start. And then, start come June and, farming activities will start. So farming and related, sectors need to open up so that people can, go and work. And in tribal areas, you also have other like, mahua picking and tenduli collection activities, and those need to start first.
Yogesh, just a quick question for you. I had heard that the Narega work had begun now in the last few days in multiple states. Is that the sense you have?
Yeah, gradually it is starting. It's kind of scattered, but it is starting.
And where it's starting, are people being paid the wages in advance?
That I'm not, really aware of. I need to check. That's a great question. I need to check
Because
the issue is the challenge that they have is that if you do direct, beneficiary transfer, they'll have to go and line up in banks, and that has been a consistent issue that people are complaining that huge lines in banks in rural areas where people are trying to get money. So that's another, that's a
understood.
challenge.
But I was thinking that even with that, it may make a lot of sense to push for an advance transfer of the 100 days work, because otherwise what you'll have delayed payments out into the month. And even if some folks then have urgent, will then go to the bank. So this could be something to think about.
Yeah.
But Gautam, even before advance payments, I think there are a lot of pending payments. Yeah. So those should be cleared.
Clearing pending payments, and the key thing is to food distribution, and that is occurring. All the villages are now getting ration that is being stocked up in ration shops and being delivered to people. So that's a good thing.
That's good.
So a lot of solutions that we hear today actually lie on building trust on the system and the kind of trust that people have on the pre-existing systems. I'm just trying to understand, and the question is basically, what are the suggestions that the panel would make to sort of address the problems that we are facing now, in the light that people who might be affected by COVID-19 are not voluntarily coming out to get tested or quarantined. There's a lot of stigma that has been attached to it. What are some of the suggestions that you would make? What's the framework that would make the system more enabling and more empathetic?
I think Gautam has already shared the experience on Ebola, and I think those are the key, lessons: is make transparent. It has to be, to increase transparency. You have to make the disclosure dignified, and it would be challenging. I mean, in Africa also, I don't think it would have developed in a short span of like few months. And Absolutely. The challenge with COVID is that we have to deal with this as a shock, and we are certainly not very prepared. So it's going to be a challenge. But again, as I said, like, making arrangements for quarantining in a dignified way and offering treatment and working with communities. I think that's the only way.
I mean, I would say in urban areas, there's no easy way to fix, structural mistrust. I mean, I wouldn't put this on urban informal communities at all. I mean, you ask if any of the four of us on this call actually trust our health system when it comes to testing and quarantine. And our answers would be fairly middling. It's not a particular thing. But I think the invitation has to come from the state. So even if the state simply says, we want a program of community leaderships, which communities are willing to come forward and work with us? We'll give you support, we'll give you information, help us screen and isolate that so your communities are safe. I think the issuing of the invitation to say that people are interested in not surveilling and policing communities and just putting barricades and cops outside, but want them to partner with the government. That invitation has to be the first step. It's not going to solve everything. But first, at least let the existing leadership that communities are showing, let it be recognized. Let them be invited by the government to be partners. And I think some cities are doing this better than others. Some states are doing this better than others. And I think the more you're able to extend that invitation, the more people have a chance to trust the government. That, and I would say just an improvement in the communication on our testing and quarantine protocols. I mean, there's a level of opacity that simply should not exist.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think a lot of sensitivity from the part of our frontline staff also. For example, policemen, like the state has also, I think, done a massive mistake in terms of framing this whole thing as a law and order issue rather than a public health crisis or an economic lockdown. So there has been a lot of cases of police brutality, especially towards poor populations, migrants who are trying to go back home. We've had on our labor line, which is our toll-free helpline that we run for workers in distress. I mean, the kind of cases of police brutality that have been registered are just mind-numbing. So I think some level of sensitivity in terms of like Yogesh was saying, like ensuring that there is dignity attached to this disclosure, and if you step out to avail treatment, you're not beaten up. If you step out to avail clean sanitation facilities because you don't have a toilet where you live, then you're not beaten up. So I think sensitivities and need to be kind of really improved for a lot of our frontline staff, though I completely empathize with their situation also, that they are on the front lines and also managing a lot of burden of this completely unprepared, unplanned kind of lockdown that the state has inflicted on us. But I think it needs to come from both sides.
Right, thank you so much. I know we've overshot our time. I'm just going to ask you one last question, and there are a few questions which have come, and we'll be sending it to you probably online and seek responses. So one last question I want to sort of understand is that let's time travel into the fact that we were in a world which was a pre-COVID world. There were changes that could have been done at that time. There were preparations that could have been done at that time. So one pressing point which we could have addressed and we still can address. So one word if you want to throw out there, or one thing that can be changed.
Expand the universe of social protection.
I think universalization of a lot of these public benefits, I think that would be a good first step.
And rural areas, essentially, it would be community engagement.
Great, thank you so much for these thoughts. We've been receiving a lot of thanks are coming from all the participants here, and thank you so much for your thoughts. I know this is a very vast topic, and like a 1 hour 20-minute session can't do justice to the it's a world in itself, and there's lots to explore. But I really want to thank all our panelists today. I also want to take a minute to thank the team. I want to thank Sarah, Shuli, Sarah, Hina, and Yukti from DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance, and Shuli from THSTI. Again, apologies for the glitch that we had, but thank you everyone who participated and stayed back with us. And a very big thank you to all the panelists today. Hope you all stay safe.
Thank you, Devi. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.